At 81, Sylvie Vartan, the once untouchable queen of French pop, finally broke her silence. It happened in a Paris studio, under the soft blue light of a primetime interview. She sat upright, composed, her famous blonde hair swept perfectly to one side. The journalist's question was simple, almost innocent. How do you feel about Laeticia Hallyday today? Sylvie took a breath. Then, for the first time in decades, she spoke without restraint. Her words cut through the room like cold glass. She accused Laeticia, the widow of Johnny Hallyday, of misunderstanding the man behind the legend, of transforming his legacy into a spectacle, of turning love into inheritance. Johnny was not a brand, she said. He was a man, fragile and immense. In that moment, France seemed to hold its breath. For years, Sylvie Vartan had remained silent, almost saint-like in her discretion. She was the symbol of eternal dignity, the ex-wife who never attacked, never commented, never entered the public war over Johnny's estate. But time changes even the quietest hearts. Behind that polished facade, an old fire had been burning, the feeling that the memory of the man she once loved was slowly being rewritten. The scene carried a rare kind of tension, not anger, but sorrow aged into clarity. The camera lingered on her face, and the audience saw not a bitter woman, but someone reclaiming a truth long stolen by noise and media. He belongs to no one, she added. Not even to me. Outside the studio, headlines exploded. Sylvie Vartan breaks her silence. The first wife versus the last. But beneath those sensational titles, there was something more fragile at play, a woman confronting the ghosts of her past. And perhaps, the loneliness of being the last living witness to an era that refuses to die. What drives an icon of discretion to finally speak? And what truth, hidden for so long, was powerful enough to make her voice tremble at last? Before there was Laeticia, before the legacy wars and the endless headlines, there was a boy named Jean-Philippe Smet and a girl named Sylvie Vartan. France called them Johnny and Sylvie, the royal couple of the Yé-Yé era, the golden duo who gave post-war youth its rhythm, its beauty, and its dream of freedom. He was the rebel in leather, she, the velvet voice that softened his rage. Together, they built an empire of music and desire, the kind that lives forever in black and white television memories. In the 1,960 seconds, they were everywhere, on tour buses, magazine covers, film sets, and concert stages where thousands screamed their names as if invoking deities. Theirs was not just a marriage, it was a myth woven into French pop culture. The young loved them, the old tolerated them, and the press worshipped them. Johnny and Sylvie, wrote Paris Match in 1965, are not just stars, they are France's reflection of itself. But myths have shadows. Even then, Johnny's appetite for excess, for freedom, fame, and fleeting passion was too vast for any one person to contain. Sylvie, ever composed, learned early that loving a legend meant living in fragments. She endured the chaos, the distance, the infidelities, because somewhere beneath the noise, there was still the boy she met at the Olympia, the one who looked at her as if music had a face. When their marriage finally broke in 1980, Sylvie did not explode, accuse, or demand pity. She simply disappeared into her art. Silence was my dignity, she later said. I didn't want to be part of the circus. That silence became her armor and perhaps her prison. Years passed. Johnny remarried, reimagined himself, and with Laeticia, found what he often called peace. To the world, she was the angel who tamed the wild beast. Young, devoted, and photogenic, Laeticia became the guardian of the Hallyday brand, managing concerts, foundations, interviews, all in the name of preserving his legacy. But to many who had known Johnny in his earlier life, this new serenity seemed strange, almost artificial. His rebellion had been ironed, his fire repackaged for nostalgia tours. And somewhere in that transformation, Sylvie sensed something sacred slipping away, not just the man she had loved, but the authenticity of what he once represented. When Johnny died in 2017, the world mourned, but France divided. The public funerals were majestic, the eulogies endless. Yet behind the marble monuments and televised tributes, a quiet storm began to rise, questions about inheritance, about who owned his music, his image, his soul. Sylvie stayed away from the noise, visiting his grave quietly, never granting interviews, never correcting the stories told by others. Her silence was both a tribute and a protest, a refusal to participate in the commodification of grief. Then came Laeticia's reign. She spoke of Johnny with fervor, reshaping him into a legend polished to perfection. Memorial concerts, documentaries, merchandising lines, every gesture seemed designed to keep him alive and marketable. She was both widow and CEO. For the younger generation, this was inspiring. For the older one, unsettling. Johnny, once the symbol of rebellion, was now a sanitized brand of patriotism and nostalgia. Sylvie, who had spent her life guarding the mystery of the man she once called my Johnny, watched from a distance. To her, it wasn't just about money or fame, it was about truth. The Johnny she knew was imperfect, wounded, impulsive, and human. The Johnny being sold to the public was something else entirely, an icon without pain, a legend without contradictions. She turned him into a statue. One friend of Sylvie's told Le Figaro, and Sylvie always believed legends should bleed a little. That belief had guided her for decades. Her songs, her voice, her melancholy presence all carried traces of a woman who had seen glory up close and understood its cost. She didn't need to fight publicly for Johnny's memory, because for her, he lived in the silences between verses, in the grain of her voice, in the concerts where she still whispered his name before singing La Maritza. But the years wore on, and the cultural narrative shifted. Younger audiences began to associate the Hallyday name solely with Laeticia. The first wife became a ghost in the background, an echo fading from collective memory. For a woman who had once stood at the center of the French dream, this erasure was more painful than betrayal. It wasn't jealousy, it was injustice. The erasure of history itself. Because Sylvie was not just an ex-wife, she was part of the legend's DNA. Without her, there would have been no Johnny as France knew him. Their youth had been the soundtrack of a nation awakening from post-war grayness. To see that story reduced to marketing campaigns and family feuds was, for her, unbearable. So when she finally spoke in 2025, it wasn't an attack. It was a correction, the voice of the past reminding the present that love and memory cannot be managed like a brand. As the camera caught her eyes that night, there was something almost sacred about her restraint. No bitterness, no malice, just a deep, weary truth. For decades, she had carried the burden of silence with grace. But legends, like ghosts, demand balance. Too much distortion, and they begin to haunt the living. And in France, a country that worships its idols, no ghost is louder than Johnny Hallyday. There is a peculiar kind of loneliness reserved for those who have loved someone unforgettable. Sylvie Vartan has lived with that loneliness for most of her life. To the public, she was the golden girl of French music. To Johnny, she was the mirror that reflected both his greatness and his fragility. And when the mirror shattered, she did what most artists do. She turned her pain into art, her silence into poetry. For years after their separation, Sylvie carried the ghost of that first love through every stage, every song, every applause. When she sang La plus belle pour aller danser, audiences heard joy, but behind that smile was nostalgia for a time when love was young and unspoiled. Each melody was a fragment of what she had lost, not just a man, but a version of herself that only existed when he was near. Johnny was not an easy man to love. He was chaos wrapped in charisma, a boy who never outgrew the ache of abandonment. Born to a mother who left him behind. Raised by an aunt. Johnny sought in every woman the unconditional devotion he had never known. Sylvie understood this instinctively. In her, he found stability. In him, she found intensity. Their bond was both healing and destructive, a collision of two stars destined to burn rather than fade. When their marriage collapsed, Sylvie did not hate him. She pitied him, and perhaps pitied herself for believing that love could save a man from his own ghosts. Johnny belonged to everyone. She once said quietly, maybe that was the problem. That single sentence contained an entire lifetime of resignation. Decades later, when Laeticia entered Johnny's world, Sylvie watched from afar, not as an enemy, but as a witness. She saw how the young woman tried to rebuild what fame had broken, the family, the structure, the peace. And yet, deep inside, she sensed that something essential was missing. Johnny had changed. He had grown older, but not freer. His image was now carefully sculpted, his emotions filtered through PR statements, his vulnerability erased. To Sylvie, this was the true tragedy. The man who once sang with rawness had become a myth that could no longer feel. Fame had embalmed him. And Laeticia, perhaps without realizing it, became the curator of that embalmed life, preserving him, protecting him, but also suffocating him beneath perfection. Love can do that. It can protect to the point of erasure. In her recent interview, when Sylvie spoke of Laeticia not understanding the man he was, it wasn't cruelty. It was grief disguised as truth. What she meant was simpler. More human, Johnny needed to be loved for his fractures, not despite them. To love him was to accept his shadows, the unpredictable, self-destructive, magnificent chaos that defined him. Laeticia had loved the man the world adored. Sylvie had loved the man the world ignored. Between those two loves lies the entire emotional geography of Johnny Hallyday. Those who knew Sylvie closely say she never stopped caring. Even after decades. Even after remarrying. She would still pause when one of his songs played unexpectedly on the radio. There was no bitterness in her, only a quiet fatigue. The kind that comes from understanding life too well. It's strange, she told a journalist once. We live entire lives. And still, one person can appear in every reflection. That reflection followed her everywhere in the echo of applause. In the way fans still paired their names as if time had not passed. For a long time, Sylvie found that flattering. Now, at 81, she finds it haunting. Because no one should have to compete with their own past. And yet, the past keeps resurfacing, especially when Laeticia speaks. Every tribute, every photo, every carefully managed memory of Johnny reminds Sylvie not of loss, but of transformation. The man who once represented rebellion is now a national monument. His voice, once rough with truth, now polished by remastered recordings. His story, edited to fit the mold of a perfect legend. Sylvie doesn't hate Laeticia for this. She pities her because she knows what it means to love a myth and not a man. To spend years protecting someone so luminous that the shadow eventually swallows you. In her youth, Sylvie believed silence was an act of love. But silence has weight. Over time, it becomes a second skin, heavy and cold. The more she tried to protect Johnny's memory by saying nothing, the more the world rewrote him without her. By 2025, her silence no longer felt noble, it felt like complicity. She realized that every story told about Johnny without nuance was erasing a part of him, and by extension, a part of her. So she spoke not to revive the past, but to restore balance. In her voice that night, there was no bitterness, only sorrow. She spoke like someone holding a cracked photograph, not to accuse, but to remember. The world saw a confrontation between two women. She saw an act of mourning. Because mourning isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about the death of truth. Johnny had once written her a letter, years after their divorce. In it, he confessed, "You are the only one who knew the man behind the noise." She never showed it publicly, but those who visited her dressing room say it sits framed behind a mirror, slightly faded, a reminder of something irreplaceable. Perhaps that's why her words in 2025 carried such weight. They weren't just criticism. They were testimony, a defense of the man she once loved, not as a star, but as a human being trapped inside the myth of himself. As she looked into the camera that night, you could almost hear the echo of every unsung goodbye. The years she spent biting her tongue, the tears hidden behind applause, the grief turned into melody. It was not anger that made her tremble, it was release. The kind of release that comes when truth finally finds air. Outside, the world debated her motives, jealousy, pride, timing. But none of that mattered. For Sylvie, this was not a battle against Laeticia. It was a final act of love toward the man she could never stop defending, even from his own legend. And in that fragile space between love and memory, she did what artists do best. She told the truth, not as it happened, but as it felt. Because the truth, after all, is emotional before it is factual. And Sylvie Vartan, even at 81, still understands that the deepest form of love is not silence. It is the courage to speak when no one wants to hear what remains unsaid. The revelation did not come from anger, it came from exhaustion. Sylvie's voice, calm but unshakable, cut through decades of silence and sentimentality. During that interview, she did not raise her tone or dramatize her story. She simply said, imperfect, deliberate French, Laeticia n'a pas compris l'homme qu'il était. Laeticia did not understand the man he was. The studio fell silent. The host blinked, unsure whether to follow the moment or retreat from it. Outside, within minutes, social media ignited. France, the country that had adored Johnny Hallyday for 60 years, divided once again not over his music, but over his memory. It was a rare moment of clarity in the fog of nostalgia. Sylvie's words were not an accusation, they were a confession. The final truth of someone who had spent a lifetime loving a myth and finally dared to call it what it was, incomplete. She wasn't questioning Laeticia's affection. She was questioning the narrative that had become too polished, too convenient. The Johnny the world now celebrated, the patriot, the saint. The polished monument was not the man she had held in her arms. Her Johnny was imperfect, volatile, vulnerable. He was tender 1 minute, destructive the next. He didn't belong on a pedestal. He belonged in a song raw, messy, alive. When Sylvie said those words, she was not fighting Laeticia. She was fighting time and the way time erases contradictions to make stories easier to love. The backlash was immediate. Commentators accused her of jealousy, of bitterness, of reopening old wounds for attention. But those who listened closely heard something else, a woman defending truth against the anesthesia of myth. She had nothing to gain, no money, no spotlight, no legacy to protect. What she sought was recognition that love, real love, is not about control. It's about letting the truth stand unedited. In the days that followed, French newspapers filled with op-eds. Some called her brave. Others called her cruel. Laeticia, ever diplomatic, responded with grace but firmness. I loved Johnny as he was in his final years, serene, grateful, free of torment. It was her truth. But Sylvie's version remained hauntingly different. Free of torment? She asked in a later radio segment. He was never free of torment. It was what made him human. There it was, the crack between two visions of love. One woman loved Johnny as a husband who needed protection. The other loved him as a man who needed to remain wild to stay alive. Both were right in their own way. But truth, as always, had chosen to live between them, elusive, burning, unreachable, in private. Those close to Sylvie said she wept after the interview aired. Not because of the controversy, but because of the finality of it all. She knew that once spoken, truth changes everything. You can't return to silence after you've named the ghost. It wasn't revenge, it was farewell. For years, Sylvie had been haunted by a single image, Johnny on stage in his last tour, under blinding lights, singing Je te promets with Laeticia watching from the wings. He looked invincible, but to Sylvie's eyes, he also looked like a man performing his own immortality. That night, she whispered to herself, he is saying goodbye to himself. That image became her private heartbreak, watching the man she once loved become an idea too large for any living heart to hold. And now, in 2025, when she finally spoke, it wasn't to wound Laeticia, but to remind the world that legends are made of flesh first, not marble. The revelation was brutal precisely because it was gentle. Sylvie had no need to dramatize what was already tragic, that love, fame, and memory are never equal in how they survive time. One becomes myth. The others become silence. And maybe, in that moment on television, she was not just talking about Johnny. Maybe she was speaking to every woman who has ever watched a man she loved turn into someone the world owned. When the cameras turned off, the studio lights dimmed, and the producers rushed to cut commercial breaks, Sylvie sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. A crew member, much younger, approached her hesitantly and whispered, "Thank you for saying it." She smiled faintly, not out of pride, but relief. For the first time in years, she felt free, not from Johnny, but from the burden of silence. That night, as Paris buzzed with commentary and analysis, Sylvie returned home, walked into her living room, and stood before the old framed photograph, her and Johnny, smiling in black and white. She touched the glass softly, as if speaking to someone who had been waiting to be acknowledged. "You were not perfect," she murmured, "and that's why I loved you." Outside, rain began to fall steady, cleansing, almost musical. It tapped against the window like applause fading into the night. For Sylvie, it was the sound of peace. In the end, it was never about rivalry. It was about memory and who gets to define it. Sylvie Vartan's words reminded France of something it often forgets, that legends are not born perfect. They are carved out of pain, doubt, and contradiction. Johnny Hallyday was not a monument to be polished. He was a man who burned so brightly that everyone around him was left both illuminated and scarred. What Sylvie did in that quiet interview was not an act of bitterness, but of preservation. She was protecting the truth from sentimentality, the kind of sentimentality that turns a living story into a souvenir. In her eyes, love without honesty is just a beautiful lie, and she had spent too many years watching that lie grow louder than the truth. There is something deeply human in her decision to finally speak. It was not a fight against Laeticia, nor a claim of ownership. It was a confession of care, a way of saying that some loves are too sacred to be simplified. When she said, "He belongs to no one," she was not drawing a line, she was erasing one. Because love, the kind that survives time and fame, is not possession, it is remembrance. In a world where fame feeds on silence, Sylvie chose to break hers. And by doing so, she restored something lost in the noise, the fragility that made Johnny human, and the vulnerability that made him great. Perhaps that is the truest form of loyalty, not to guard a myth, but to protect the soul within it. Years from now, when people revisit the music, the concerts, the chaos, they may forget the arguments over inheritance and legacy, but they will remember two women who loved the same man in two very different ways, one in light, one in shadow, and between them, the echo of a voice that still sings through the ages, raw, imperfect, unforgettable. Because in the end, as Sylvie Vartan knows too well, legends die twice, first when their bodies disappear, and again when their truth is forgotten. She simply refused to let the second death happen.